Hello, changelings, and welcome to the Night Garden. I'm VampireAntihero, and this is Conquer Thy Fear Studio. Hello, everybody. If you've been here before, then welcome back, changeling. Long story incredibly short, I'm now 3 years into a professional career after about a 6-year hiatus from art altogether, and I'd like to take you all on this wild ride with me. So I've decided to put together this series of classes free on YouTube that talk about the art fundamentals and kind of the mindset that goes into being an artist and getting started on the journey, because it can be incredibly frustrating at points. Quick reminder that if you like this video and find it useful, you can support me over at coffee.com/VampireAntihero. You can become a member of the fan club or give a one-time tip there. The link is in the description below. This video is a continuation of my previous class video about where to start in learning the fundamentals of art. In that video, I mentioned that anatomy, perspective, and proportion are more intermediate topics despite being fundamentals of art that are a little bit harder to understand. That video is linked in the description below, or if I can figure it out, it will be hovering somewhere on the screen here. So what do I mean by these things being intermediate topics despite being fundamentals and cornerstones of art? Well, look at it this way. When we sit down to draw, we're all excited about this thing that we see in our heads, this idea that we've come up with, and we're not necessarily thinking about math. That's not to say that we need to do math to do good artwork or accurate drawings, but rather there are some things that we need to learn to intuitively understand so that we don't have to do math in order to do good drawings. A lot of what goes into making good art is knowing how to trick the eye to believe that there is space where there isn't, and that objects believably exist in those spaces. Artists are basically pulling magic tricks. We are magical beings. In this video, I'll be taking us through the four worlds of proper anatomy, proportion, and the different points of perspective, and we'll break it down so that it feels less out of reach and more something that we can intuitively understand as we're laying things out in a piece. Speaking of laying everything out in a piece, let's move on to the first point of the lesson, perspective. I promise I'll stay away from too many puns. Perspective on its own is a pretty straightforward fundamental. It seems like it's easy to understand, but for some reason it all falls apart for beginner artists when they actually try to implement it in their art. So why is perspective so hard to understand? We'll get to that in a moment. If you've watched other people talk about the fundamentals, specifically perspective, then chances are you've seen something like this. And this is perspective in a nutshell. The cubes represent objects and how they look in your field of view. Your field of view is essentially your canvas or your paper. It's talking about what you can see. The horizon line in the center of the canvas is where your eye level is, not the floor. These points that are mentioned are vanishing points. This is the point where you'd no longer be able to see the objects because they are too far away. So in our 1-point perspective, wherever our figure is standing would be above these cubes and looking slightly down at them. In the 2-point perspective example, the cube is floating above our sight line, and the 3-point perspective is below us. So if a piece is at a 1-point perspective, and you're looking at something straight on in front of you, like this box here, you're just trying to figure out how far it would have to go to have all of the lines meet at one point, or where it vanishes. When you're looking at 2-point perspective, the thing we're looking at isn't straight on, right? It's kind of at an angle. So now you're just figuring out the vanishing point of this box would be somewhere over here off screen, and the vanishing point of this side would be somewhere over here off screen. We're just trying to figure out where each side vanishes at those vanishing points. 3-point perspective is the same general idea as this, only now the 3rd point is somewhere way off from the horizon line because we're looking at something very tall or very deep that would eventually vanish somewhere way off from our field of view if we were to allow those lines to keep going. So it's simple to understand in theory. But what makes perspective an intermediate topic despite it being a fundamental? Well, a lot of artists find it extremely hard to implement into their drawings. What makes it so hard to implement is that it's very easy to distort something when you're looking at it at an angle. And you can see this in all three of these examples here. In our 1-point perspective on the left, if these are meant to be cubes, the top and visible side faces here are way too long. Looking at this object straight on that side face, it would look something more like this, a long rectangle. In the example, the 2-point perspective would also not really be a cube, but rather a large object that's a lot shorter than its width. PastFam forgot to mention this, so I'll just mention real quick that there are 2 ways you can either fix this or change your perspective to make it look a little bit less distorted. And that is either move your vanishing points further out along your horizon line, like this, or you can make smaller line distances to make a smaller cube overall. The 3-point perspective rectangle is great for a rectangle, but if these are meant to be cubes, then there's no way that object is a cube, right? Ultimately, a lot of what comes down to good perspective is making choices based on what angle you're seeing something at, and where that thing would vanish. Once you have your main object placed, everything in this image would be based on those vanishing points and really sell the idea of that object existing in space. If you'd like to see more examples of this, then I recommend David Finch's video on perspective, also linked in the description below. Look at that! We understand perspective and we didn't even have to whip out a calculator. Okay, so now that we've broken that down in a way that we can understand, what does proportion or anatomy have to do with any of that? Perspective and proportion kind of go hand in hand, and proportion and anatomy go hand in hand when talking about characters and creatures. So next we'll be talking about proportion. It might feel like anatomy is an outlier in this conversation, but it will make sense later, I promise. Proportion, at its core, is looking at how big or small something is in relation to the things around it. So let's look at what that can do for us. Here we have a person. Now, people can be different heights and shapes and sizes, obviously, but let's say that this is the most average of average person sizes, and all the people we're drawing in this world are the same exact average. Now we have a horizon line, so we have our person existing in a space, right? But Vamp, you say, that's perspective, you just talked to us about this. Yes, and perspective puts the character in the space. But now let's add some other average people here in our view. Suddenly, we can see roughly how far these people are from us, right? This also works with objects. For example, if we look at our person here and we want to draw them next to a building, we know that the door will roughly be about a head higher than our figure to allow comfortable passing through the doorway. So I can figure that out with perspective lines, like this. I have my perspective points outside of my field of view in a 2-point perspective, though this you could really do with a 1-point perspective if you made the building a little bit longer and hid that corner on the right. I've drawn the shape of the head stacked on top of my person to show the height that I want the door to be at. Is trace these gray lines that I've drawn to make sure that the door feels like it's in a space correctly compared to where we, the viewer, are looking at it, and it winds up looking like this. We use proportion along with perspective to show us how close or far something is to us, or to really make sure that something is drawn in a way that makes sense in relation to everything else on the page. We can also exaggerate proportions in order to make things feel fantastical or add a certain mood to a piece. This is something I'll talk about in the next class that I put together. For now, let's move on to anatomy. We'll talk a little bit more about proportion as we're talking about anatomy as well. So if perspective is where our objects and characters exist in our field of view, and proportion is figuring out how big those things are in relation to each other, then we can think of anatomy as the building blocks of the living things that exist in our space. These are all building blocks together. A lot of artists study anatomy to a medical accuracy, which can be extremely daunting for beginners. You don't need to know what each piece of a body part is called in order to draw it correctly, but you do need to know how things move and what influences what in order to make your characters believable. One of the easiest examples of anatomy that I can show this with is an arm. So let's start with that. Okay, so here we have a messy sketch of an outstretched arm. It's very basic. You can see that I have the outlines defined as basic as possible with 2 cylinders and a circle. You can think about this as the base of our arm. Now I'm going to throw some muscles on here. The gray ones are muscle groups that won't be affected, but they're major points on the arm, right? The upper gray muscle is the shoulder, and the lower gray on the forearm, which that controls wrist movement. The dark blue muscle groups are the important ones in this example. Those are the triceps and the biceps. We're going to be bending this character's elbow. You can see in this example with the arm outstretched, our bicep, or the top group, looks long and thin, whereas the bottom group, or the tricep, looks shorter and kind of fat. This is because these two muscle groups work together in order to control the hinge that our elbow makes. When one is working, the other is relaxed. So when we bend our character's elbow like this, you can see that the work shifts to the other side of the muscles. When one is pulling, the other is relaxing. If we can understand how each group of muscles works, then we can start to realize and implement how their shapes affect body parts and what they'll look like under the skin. So then how does proportion relate to anatomy? Well, for that, let's look at a face. When you're looking at a face, there are a lot of pieces that are equally distant from one another and also measured based on the size of something else in an average face. If you've looked up anatomy before or tips on how to draw characters or faces, then chances are that you've heard of the Loomis method. This is basically a face method that an artist, Andrew Loomis, came up with, and most illustrators use some form of it to make sure that they have a solid foundation to their head. This method talks a lot about proportion as well, so we'll go through this together. Okay, so typically I work on a tonal background when I'm drawing, but to keep things consistent, let's start on this blue background. The Loomis method, at its core, is a sphere. In this method, you divide the sphere in half, and this is where your brow line sits. So let's get started with that. Here's our sphere. I'm going to flip it real quick to make sure that, oh god, it is not even. So let me do that. That's looking better. Okay. So now I'm going to cut this in half. Which is roughly there. And this is going to be our brow line. Now I'm going to cut it down the middle. It's not quite center. And this is our center line. So our center line will show us where roughly our symmetry is in the face. And now we're going to do another line. Let's roughly sketch out the average of this circle here, right? Just so that we're not lost. This line is going to cut this circle flat. I'm going to do it on both sides. These aren't quite the same size, but there we go. So now if I erase this, you get the point where the flat planes on your face are. Because the head isn't fully round, right? So then we're going to do another line right here lining up with the bottom of the circle. It's not straight. Okay. Okay, so this is going to roughly be where our nose sits. So if I measure this right here is going to roughly be where our hairline is. And then we're going to take the same size as those other two portions and make a line here. And that's where our chin rests. And this is for a perfectly average face, and nobody is perfectly average, so you can play with these a little bit, but this is essentially how you make a Loomis head. So your mouth here is going to be somewhere right in between. I'm going to say it's right there for right now, but we might move it. I'm going to make a circle to show the tip of my nose, and then a diamond in that circle, because that's how I signify a nose for myself. And then here, I'm just going to do a little indication of this plane receding. That is the dip in your bridge of your nose. We just bring this down to show the top of our nose. This is the sides. You wouldn't necessarily bring this down. This is just something that I do. But then our eyes, your eye sockets will roughly be able to fit 3 across, right? So your brow is the top of this eye socket. You bring it about halfway down the cheek. And then our cheekbones kind of line up with the bottom of this sphere. Your ear hits the top of the brow bone, and then the nose line. And then your chin, your mouth kind of shows where your jaw starts to curve. So I'm going to go out, and then you meet that by the ear. Your center of your eye shows where the corners of your mouth are. And this just looks like a whole bunch of scribbles for right now. But now I'm going to lower the opacity on this. I'm going to draw over it to show kind of what I mean. So here we have an eye, and then on the same line here, and that actually might be a little bit high. Let me move those down a little, because this is your eyebrow line. So I'll put these further down like that. If we're just looking forward, then this is where our focus is for our iris. Then we've got our eyebrows wrapping around the top of that eye socket. You've got your nostrils lining up with the intersections of the sphere. Actually, I'm going to make my mouth more centered to this circle bottom here. I'm going to just kind of bring our hairline like that. A little bit of a jut out from the ear, because your hair isn't directly flat to your skin, right? So probably be something like that. These are your cheekbones here. And I'll just kind of sketch in this jaw. And the ears. And right around the curve of the jaw is where we'd have our neck. So there is a Loomis head. If you'd like more examples of the Loomis head, then Proco did an entire series on it that is fantastic. And also, David Finch talks about the Loomis head in a fantastic way as well. and I'll have both of those links in the description below. There's so much more that can go into anatomy and varying degrees of science and rules and whatnot, but honestly, the best thing for learning anatomy is to practice. Draw multiple heads trying out this method, look at people in real life, draw figure drawings, use references to draw, time yourself and focus on shapes and forms as you sketch from a reference. One resource that I like using for this is lineofaction.com, which is a free site that has the options to set up references to change automatically on a timer. Kind of like how a live figure drawing class would do with a live model. And no, I'm not affiliated, I'm just a fan. Now that we've covered anatomy a little bit, one last thing that I would like to mention is that in terms of proportion, a lot of artists will measure their heights of their characters with their heads. So when you hear like comic artists talk about the height of their character, or read like those beginner artist books, they'll have a diagram of a character with 8 heads stacked next to it, or 7.5 heads stacked next to it. Whatever their measurements are that make them feel like their characters in proportion. So that ultimately comes up to choice, but the general rule is between 7 and 8 heads. So keep that in mind as well. So as you can see, these building blocks can feel a little bit overwhelming at first. But at the end of the day, these concepts are pretty easy to follow with a little bit of practice and understanding. To put everything together to make a cohesive drawing, we'll have to cover our last fundamental, composition. Composition is pretty involved, so we'll talk about that next time. I hope this helps you understand these fundamentals a little bit better, and if it was helpful for you, let me know in the comments below. If you like and subscribe, that also helps out the channel. If you're interested in my artwork, you can check out my website at conquerthyfear.com, or you can follow me on these social media, all under VampireAntihero. I'd like to thank my Ko-fi supporters for making it possible for me to continue making this content. I couldn't do this kind of stuff without you. That's Jen Frank, Life is Great, and Lovely Rosie T. Thank y'all for everything that you do. And with that, I think we've made it to the end of the video. Thank you for watching, and until next time, make sure that you all stay safe, drink your water, and do what you can. I love y'all.